we still have plenty to do, and the panel is called Evaluating Local Government in Latin America. That's what appears on the program. But of course, it's in a conference called Assessing Democracy. I don't think we're trying to evaluate all aspects of local government. I think that the aspect that we will be dealing with is the subnational quality of democracy question. Now, if you take a very restrictive view of what we mean by democracy, a minimalist definition, then perhaps it only applies to regimes at the national level, in which case there would be no issue to investigate beyond that. But if you take any of the broader democracy assessment approaches that have been discussed earlier this morning, it's inevitably the question, well, if you can ask that and use those techniques to investigate the status, the quality of democracy at the national level, why not also do that at the subnational level? And in fact, the approach that Leonardo put forward and that is in the IDEA document has already been applied. Notably, I remember it being applied to the 32 states of Mexico, within Mexico, where it's worth remembering that although, in some sense, Mexico democratized at the national level in the year 2000, there were some states, such as Baja California, where you could say that substantial progress towards democracy had taken place before that. And there were other states within Mexico where you could say it hasn't happened yet, or at least it's only just happening now. So the question, the temporal issue arises, as well as the question of the actual content, the quality of the democratization. And we will come to that because Jesus Tovar is one of the people involved in the comparisons in Mexico. It's also worth mentioning, because Mitch Seligson said it this morning, that the kind of inquiries that LAPOP carries out enables one to drill down below the national level and disaggregate some of these questions in a more regional way. And he just to quote an example that he gave, which I think is very relevant, he noted that looking within Argentina, you found that there were greater variations on the crucial question of corruption between different provinces of Argentina than perhaps between a large number of the national democracies that we're looking at. So there is a case for looking at the subnational level. The subnational level has many possible meanings. In Brazil, we have a three-level system. In Argentina, it's just provinces. In Mexico, it's fundamentally states, although there's also the municipal level. So I'm trying to qualify a little bit this evaluating local government, but I must get on from my saying what the panel is about to discussing presenting the three papers. And although Leonardo Avritzer is not, and Enrique Peruzzotti are not here to present their paper, it is circulated. I think the discussants have seen it. So for those who would have expected to hear something of it from Leonardo, let me just give you a few very quick headlines. I'm not going to be presenting it. It's not my work. I'm not defending it. Just reminding you of what they do. They looked at altogether 8 countries, and they divided them into 2 categories. They're interested in mainly in the category which they call contested liberalism, Brazil, Chile, and Uruguay. But they want to make a contrast between those 3 and the other 5 South American countries where, from their point of view, they say the problem is that the party system collapsed under the process of populist rejection of neoliberalism. And their basic, that's Argentina, Bolivia, Ecuador, Peru, and Venezuela, and their basic argument then is that supplementary or additional forms of political representation are not going to work well in contexts where the party system collapsed. However, looking at the three countries where, from their point of view, they call it contested liberalism, there is not consensus about the economic model, there is not consensus perhaps about the political model, but there is institutional continuity, Brazil, Chile, and Uruguay. I'm going to just read the two principal claims, all right? The aim of this paper is to inquire over the particular circumstances under which participatory developments might contribute to the strengthening of representative government and under those in which they do not. The main hypothesis that guides the argument is that participatory institutions are more likely to play an important role at recreating and expanding representative practices in those democracies that do not suffer the collapse of their party systems, such as Brazil, Chile, and Uruguay. Those societies were able to avoid the breakdown of their representative systems, but were also, and this is the key part of the paper, able to expand the practice of representation through the introduction of arenas of institutionalized participation. Now, those arenas are not really national arenas, mainly they are more local arenas. And the paper then discusses both in the case of Brazil, where it's more developed, the participatory budgeting and also political participation in such matters as urban planning and healthcare provision. And then it goes on from there to discuss the participation in Montevideo, which was broken up into smaller components in order to permit post-representative, as they would call it, forms of political participation in Montevideo. And it discusses a little bit also the Chilean cases, which mainly have to do, so far, with the Mapuche and with quite localized indigenous questions. So that's what the paper does. I should say that the Brazilian case emerges as the more significant of the three, that in the case of the Chilean efforts, the two constraints that are highlighted are particularly the centralization of the Chilean political system and the prevalence of technocracy. So it doesn't leave much space for this kind of thing. And in the case of Uruguay, there is said to be a significant presence there, but the constraint is provided actually by the elaborate and persistent presence of the party system. So there isn't so much, the parties tend to colonize such activities. And the conclusion is, if one the conclusion, by the way, highlights the Brazilian part of this then, if one compares the social performance of participatory and non-participatory cities in Brazil, the social performance of the former is, they say, far superior to the one exhibited by the non-participatory cities. That's a book by Avritzer. Brazil's case also shows that active citizenship, public participation, can improve access to social services by excluded sectors of the population, while simultaneously strengthening and expanding the structures of representative government. So I think that's as much as I can do to present what Leonardo Avritzer and Enrique Peruzzotti were going to present. And so I'm now going to move to our second ponente, which is Jacqueline Behrend from the San Martin and CONICET in Argentina, who's going to be talking about the provinces of Argentina.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Leonardo, for the invitation to present at this very, very interesting conference. And I was very happy to hear earlier this morning that a lot of the speakers were saying we need to look at the subnational, because that's what I'm going to try to do now. And I agree to a great extent that if we want to be able to look at the functioning of democracy, we need to look at how it functions and how uneven it can be in some federal countries. Okay. So my main question here with this paper is, how does democratization occur at the subnational level? We know quite a lot now about how democratization and democratic transitions occur at the national level, but we still know relatively little about how political change occurs at the subnational level. And in the last few years, there has been a growing literature on the persistence of illiberal, or even some authors say authoritarian politics at the subnational level after the transition to democracy. So after the national transition. And an emphasis on the uneven spread of democracy within a single democratic country. So some progress has been made in identifying some of the variables that perhaps explain. And first of all, I wanted to present a bit the state of the agenda and some of the main questions that I have here. So we know little about how subnational political change leading to further democratization happens. And the question is, can we expect subnational democratization to follow similar paths to national democratization? Does it make analytical sense to speak of transitions, for example, as part of the literature on subnational politics does? Or is this a concept that doesn't really help us understand how political change occurs in provinces or states? What role, for example, can the federal government play in democratizing provinces or states further? And these are both theoretical and empirical questions. Theoretical because they lead us to think about how different institutional arenas function in relation to each other and also autonomously. And empirical because we need to look at the actual processes and try to understand how things can change and how they function. So what I'm going to do here is focus on 3 Argentine provinces, but first present a bit of a theoretical and conceptual discussion. So in the last few years, I think we can divide the agenda on subnational democratization into 3 main agendas. And it also goes in chronological order. First, the first pioneering studies were mapping a bit the unevenness of democracy at the subnational level, and trying to understand how subnational democracy is restricted, in what areas, and also where. In what dimensions of democracy and in what regions of the different countries it was restricted. Then some part of the research moved into the causes of this restriction in subnational democracy, or the causes of the unevenness of subnational democracy. And here a lot of different hypotheses were developed, some of them focusing on fiscal issues, others on intergovernmental relations, yet others on path dependence and endogenous reasons. Then there were structural arguments, geography, etc. And here, the point I would like to make is that I think a lot of the recent work we've seen seems to be focusing on unicausal explanations, like saying it's just the fiscal element that makes some provinces or states less democratic, it's rentierism, or it's intergovernmental relations, or it's the electoral system. And these kinds of approaches lead us to think that if we reform one thing, and here we're thinking about the policy implications, right, then democracy will follow. And what I'm trying to show in my paper is the complexity of subnational democratization. Really, I think just like democracy is multidimensional, then also democratization and lack of democratization is multicausal, and we need to focus on the interaction of the different causes, and this is what I'm going to try to show today. So my question right now is basically, how does subnational democratization occur, and how do we assess political change? So what happens? And there are few theories that really lead us to think about how subnational political change can happen. And Edward Gibson is one of the authors who has developed a framework for assessing subnational political change. And he focuses centrally on a model of democratization that is either party-led or center-led. So this is basically what I'm going to build on and try to assess through my study of 3 provinces in Argentina. So first, the theoretical problem is, what does the concept of subnational democratization refer to, right? And Laurence was just mentioning, for example, in Mexico, some states started democratizing, or the political opening started before the national transition to democracy. In Brazil, that is also true to a certain extent, right? With Abertura, there was competition at the subnational level before there was more competition at the national level. In Argentina, it all happened together in one go, but then there was a different rhythm. So basically, I distinguish two types of subnational democratization. One could be subnational democratization in a non-democracy, which would be the Mexican case or Brazilian. Political opening begins at the state or provincial level. Then the second, which is what I'm going to be focusing on today, would be subnational democratization in a democracy, which is a phrase I borrow from King and Lieberman when they're talking about the United States, which refers to the uneven spread of democracy in federal countries that have already undergone a transition to democracy. So this is what I'm going to be looking at, how things occur at different paces. So there have been several concepts that have been circulating for the subnational level in recent years. The first one is subnational authoritarianism, which has become a bit hegemonic in the literature. The idea that there are authoritarian regimes at the subnational level. Implicit in this view is the idea that provinces or states have political regimes that are comparable to the national regimes, which I think, and I will elaborate further, is a bit problematic because they have different competences and also because provinces and states are contained within a national political regime. So we have to take this into account. Then building on the literature on national political regimes, which is very vast, and Morlino here is one example, and Terry Carl and Larry Diamond. There is the literature on subnational hybrid regimes with Kelly McMahon on Russia and Kyrgyzstan, and I used this concept as well to refer to Argentina and Carbassoni. Then subnational undemocratic regimes, which is similar to authoritarian. There really isn't much difference. And then Laurence and I, in a project that we are working on, we've been working now for the last 4 years, we've developed the concept of illiberal structures and practices, which what it tries to do is move away from the idea of regimes as bounded wholes at the subnational levels because they are contained, and also because what we see is not necessarily comparable to the kind of authoritarian regimes that were present at the national level in many of the countries that we are discussing. So it's a bit problematic to be saying that some provinces in Argentina are authoritarian regimes, which leads us immediately to think of the dictatorship, or the same in Brazil, for example. It's problematic to think that Bahia was formerly an authoritarian regime like the military government used to be. So and also the idea that when we use the concept of subnational authoritarianism, we seem to be referring to the whole political system as a bounded whole. And the idea of illiberal structures and practices shows that there can be certain aspects of a political system that are illiberal, and that they coexist perfectly with other aspects that are democratic, reasonably democratic. So we're trying to grasp this variation at the subnational level with this concept. So in general, my argument is that in regimes where the national political regime is reasonably democratic, we generally see a minimum threshold of democracy in most provinces or states. There may be situations for a brief period of time when this is not so, but in generally there is a minimum threshold. So what is the problem there? There are other dimensions that we need to explore to understand. So this is part of my theoretical argument to try to say that basically because subnational units cannot be considered authoritarian in a conventional way, as was usually understood in the literature on national democratization, then analyzing patterns of continuity and change and in their institutions and practices, for example, is harder in both empirical and theoretical terms. And we do not seem to have the conceptual tools, I think, at this stage yet to analyze this. So, for example, the concept of transition is not so useful to think about subnational political democratization because the transition has already happened at the national level. We have a democratic regime. It's an imperfect one. It may not be desirable. It may not be normatively what we want. But in general, the minimum requirements of democracy are there. So then transition doesn't really help us very much. And also because if the idea is that the regime is at the national level, then transition occurs at the national level, at the federal. So this concept of illiberal structures and practices allows us to capture important and recurrent practices that challenge democracy. I think the importance here is that what we see are challenges to democracy at the subnational level, and that extend beyond the stricter limits of an authoritarian regime. In some cases, on some occasions, there have been maybe authoritarian regimes in the south of the US, for example, which is where Gibson develops his framework. But I think in most of the cases that we're looking at, that is not the case, and we need to be able to grasp them into the framework. So this is what I'm trying to do. So here we have a model of two types of, Gibson speaks of transitions, I will speak of political change to avoid that word. Party-led transitions, which is the development of new electoral coalitions, and the opposition reaches office. So it would imply a change within the rules of the game at the subnational level, and center-led transitions or change, where there is a direct intervention of federal government in subnational politics to force a change in the rules of the game, generally a change in electoral rules of the game, and level the electoral playing field and enable the opposition to reach office. Now, implicit in this view is the idea that once the opposition reaches office, democratization will follow. So the idea is that once alternation occurs, we have democratization. This is one of the points that I would like to challenge in this paper. And I do so by looking at 3 cases in Argentina that were intervened by the federal government. When Gibson speaks of center-led intervention, he is talking about this kind of federal intervention where the federal authorities take over and the provincial government and replace provincially elected authorities. But he's also talking in some cases about intervention through courts. Supreme Court, for example, in the United States, and the whole issue of civil rights. And I'm taking the example of Argentina here, although it would be interesting later to draw the implications for other countries that don't use this mechanism. I'm using it because this is one of the cases he takes, but also because Argentina has a very powerful tool built into its constitution that exists in many federal countries but has not been used to the same extent in the other federal countries, and this is federal intervention, what I was saying when the federal authorities intervene and replace elected authorities. The United States has this incorporated, but it hasn't used it in this way. I think Brazil has it as well, but it has never used it. In India, it has been used, and in Russia, it has been used substantially as well. And these are 2 cases that in our project we do take into account. So even though I'm speaking about Argentina, I'm thinking of all these cases. So in Argentina, the first point to be made is that historically, federal intervention was not used with democratic ends in mind. It was basically used to try to get an ally into power at the subnational level. And it was very much used by all presidents throughout the 20th century, and it has also been used after the transition to democracy, with some exceptions. Not during Alfonsin's government, not during Dualde's very brief government either. And not in Cristina Fernández de Kirchner's government yet either. But it was used a lot by President Menem and by De la Rúa and by Kirchner. So after 1983, 4 provinces were intervened on 6 occasions. 2 of the provinces were intervened twice, basically. And basically, many provinces, this is the context that is given to understand why there was low contestation in some of these provinces. After the transition to democracy in 1983, a lot of provinces introduced a majoritarian bias into their electoral system, and this allowed supermajorities to develop, right? And governors that appeared to be invincible. So I've chosen 3 provinces. I've left one of the provinces that was intervened out because it was done so for partisan reasons and it didn't have any democratic real issues there. These were provinces that were intervened after massive protests or human rights scandals. And these were also protests against the subnational political systems. These 3 provinces were ruled by powerful political families. Alternation occurred in all cases after federal intervention. But the big question that remains there is, did democratization occur after federal intervention? And if it did, along what dimensions did they democratize? So this is what I would like to assess here. And I'm going to assess it by focusing on some areas or dimensions of political change. One is electoral contestation, whether these kind of hegemonic political systems became more competitive, and whether there was more competition between different parties. The other is family politics, because in many Argentine provinces, not just these three, there are powerful political families that have dominated, not just since 1983, but for most of the 20th century as well. Also, state-protected violence. I am including here violence that comes directly from the state and violence that comes from other groups, but that has the protection of the state, or the connivance of state institutions like the police. And also control of the judiciary. I would like to clarify that in general, I also include control of local media, and also of what I call business opportunities, the relation between business and the provincial state. But because it was more difficult to get comparable data for these three provinces, I have focused on these four now to assess change. So what I'm going to do is look at before and after, right? So there are two possible scenarios. The first one, which is the optimistic equation, which would be following Gibson's model, would be there is a political crisis, there are massive mobilizations, national media attention, there is a federal intervention. This is important because there is no federal intervention unless the protests reach the national media, unless it reaches national attention. A lot of protests remain very local and nothing really happens. And after federal intervention, there is alternation of the party in power and subnational democratization. So this is what we would like to see if it happens. The second one is what I see in my three cases, to a greater or lesser extent, and in many other cases as well. Political crisis, massive mobilization, national media attention, federal intervention, alternation, reproduction of illiberal structures and practices. In many cases, through alternation, a new family or political party in power that tries to stay on for as long as the previous one was in power and tries to have similar structures of control and interrelation between the different spheres of government and lack of checks and balances. This does not mean that there is no political change. One of my conclusions of the paper is that there can be, most notably, change in dismantling repressive political systems. That is an element, and it's not a minor one, where the federal government has been able to introduce change. But in other elements, it's much more difficult, which I think leads us to think that democratization is a bit more complex, and it's very slow-moving, and we need to have a very long-term perspective. And I'm not saying that this is not going to happen and it's not going to develop, but we need to have a very long-term view of this in order to see what happens. So the three provinces I look at are Catamarca. Quickly, yes, and I'm going to do this very quickly. Catamarca, Corrientes, and Santiago del Estero. They have a similar background of political families that dominated for a long time. Huge, human rights scandal in the case of Catamarca over the death of a young woman, which was the responsibility of the sons of many of the political leaders of the province, and then federal intervention. Now, what I look at here with the issue of contestation is Catamarca was dominated by a family called the Sadi family that was in the Behrend party. But there was also another very important family, the Castillo family in the Radical Party. The interesting thing is that if we evaluate, the competitiveness, looking at the distance between the margin of victory of the governor, we see an improvement immediately following the federal intervention, but afterwards it goes back to the same situation as before. And what we see basically in the case of Catamarca is that there was a change in the electoral rules, the majoritarian bias of the political system was eliminated, alternation occurred, and electoral politics became more competitive in the very short term, but not in the long term. A new political family appeared, the Castillo family, and when it was replaced, and then the new dominance of the Radical Party, and then recently it was replaced again by a member of the previous family, the Sadi family. So it shows the resilience and the persistence of family politics. But the important thing here is the dismantling of a repressive political system. Control of the judiciary continued during after alternation, during the radical government, and it has only evolved more positively recently. Corrientes is different to the other two cases because it did not have a repressive political system, but it had massive mobilizations against the political families that ruled the province. And the repression came with the federal government before the intervention. Now, interestingly, we had the replacement of again, we see the same thing. Competitiveness didn't really change after federal intervention. We had alternation. The provincial parties were replaced by a new coalition headed by the Radical Party. And basically, we saw a new family called the Colombi family, alternating between two cousins until now. And now the competition is between the cousins. So that's the interesting. When there is competition, it happens within the family. So it doesn't mean that we see competition, but and if we look at it from the outside, oh, we see two political parties, but they're part of the same family, so it's kind of tricky. So this is what I see there. But there is little evidence there of control of the judiciary, so we can see that there is some democratization in that level, and there is no evidence of state-protected violence, so that is also an improvement. Santiago del Estero was the most extreme of all cases, and it was one that was taken as a model of subnational authoritarianism. It had a political family called the Juarez family for a long time. It had two federal interventions, and after the last federal intervention in 2004, we have a new political family, a governor called Zamora, who recently flaunted the provincial constitution and attempted to stand for a third term in office. And finally, the federal Supreme Court had to come in and block his attempts. And what he did was the typical thing. His wife stood for candidate and has just won the elections a week ago with a very high margin of victory. So again, if we look at contestation there, the margin of victory is even higher than it used to be before. So what do we see? The majoritarian bias, the electoral rules are changed, but it gets worse. We have a new political family, but the repressive political structures were dismantled, which is a good thing for the people who have to live in Santiago del Estero. So this is not a lesser point. And there is persistence of a strong control of the judiciary, and this was seen in the recent Supreme Court ruling, the local Supreme Court ruling, right? So to quickly round up, Gibson's framework would be the idea that an exogenous change disrupts previously stable political arrangements and opens the door for institutional change, leading to democratization. In these three case studies, we see a fair amount of political change on the level of repression, but also a fair amount of resilience, adaptation, and continuity. Adaptation to new electoral rules, adaptation to, working around the idea of alternation, and also control of the judiciary. So my conclusion is basically federal intervention is most likely to succeed in dismantling repression, but not really in the other dimensions that I'm trying to look at. So the long-term tendency shows a lot of resilience for the lack of competitive elections in the provinces. It also shows that family politics is very sticky and resilient, so maybe we see more of a path dependence explanations here. New political families are developing all the time, so we got rid of the old ones that come from the 19th or 20th century, but we've got new families from the 21st century. This is an example also of the Kirchners in Santa Cruz, for example, and in many other provinces in Argentina. Control of the judiciary is also very resilient. So I think, I'm not trying to be very negative here, but I think in the long term, maybe, we need to look at other factors such as generational change, political learning, and things that will happen more gradually over time. So the policy implications are not very optimistic here. Earlier we were told that we should be thinking about them. I don't have any at this point. What I'm thinking is that any idea that we can swiftly reform something and produce immediate change doesn't seem to be working very well in these cases. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. And now Yanina Welp from the University of Zurich.
Okay, thanks Leonardo, thanks Laurence for giving me the opportunity to share my work in this very inspiring event. My presentation will focus on the study of both legal provisions and practices of recall referendum in the local level in the Andean countries. This type of referendum is defined as a bottom-up mechanism of direct democracy, from now on MDD, and is activated by collection of signatures and oriented to remove an elected authority from office through a vote. With Peru in a prominent position, this device has become one of the most extensively used mechanisms of participation in South America. However, it has been practically ignored by scholars until very recent times. This lack of interest could be explained by the following. Two movements dominate the promotion of citizen participation in Latin America. One from the top, from national government, in what has been identified as the constitutionalization of the participation, Colombia 1991 or Venezuela 1999 as examples, and other from the bottom, from the municipalities, Porto Alegre or Montevideo as well-known experiences driven by left-winger parties since late 80s. Studies on direct democracy have been mostly focused on the national level, while studies on the wider range of deliberative institutions have focused especially on the local level. This placed the recall referendum as a marginal institution for both. The previous is reinforced by the focus of MDD research on direct intervention of citizens in policy making or in populist use of top-down referenda. Against that, the recall referenda is oriented to remove representatives. For instance, some scholars such as Papadopoulos or Kaufman and Waters exclude the recall referendum from the group of MDD. Last, studies of participatory democracy give prominence to deliberation and consensus, while the recall referendum promotes binary decisions and polarizations and is expressed through traditional electoral participation. On March 17, 2013, took place the recall referendum against the mayor of Lima, Susana Villaram. After Hugo Chavez in 2004, this was the most important attempt of removing an executive through a vote in the region. However, rather than being an exceptional event, the case could be considered part of a trend. This year, 2013, the recall referendum reached the 5,000 activations in Peru. Between 2008 and 2010, more than 700 attempts were registered in Ecuador, and more than 100 ended with a referenda. Hundreds of attempts were also registered in Bolivia in 2012, and the same applies for Colombia since its legal introduction. Even more, in Colombia, a process against the mayor of Bogotá, Gustavo Petro, was interrupted this week when the Attorney General's office, La Procuraduría, removed him from office. The numbers of Table 1 justify the question I'm dealing with. Why Peru has become the country with the highest intensity activating recall referendums in the Andean countries. I should add that according with our research, the rank applies to the world, position in which Peru is followed by the United States with more than a century of experiences, and closing time by Poland. The recall referendum was introduced in Peru by the Asamblea Constituyente Democrática, which elaborated a new constitution after Alberto Fujimori's autogolpe in 1992. There is a concern regarding the reasons for which legislators promote rules which could be used against themselves as political actors. In the Peruvian case, it seems to be a result of a confluence between the ideology of a renovated left, oriented to introduce participatory mechanisms. The experience of Izquierda Unida in some municipalities during the 80s works as a precedent, and the anti-partisan ideology of the Fujimorism. In the absence of the main traditional parties, which decided to not take part, expecting to erode the legitimacy of a constitution still into force 20 years after, these positions were overrepresented. But the introduction of legal provisions is not enough to explain practices or public support. In this regard, despite the economical growth of the last decades and the several political changes lived from then, the recall referendum has had a constant presence on the Peruvian municipalities, as can be seen in Table 2. And according with several surveys, more than a third part of the Peruvians agreed with recall referendum. Thus, first condition, the existence of legal provisions. Second, a negative perception of an authority and the identification of the recall referenda with a solution. In other words, the recall referendum is expected to be activated more frequently if dissatisfaction with democracy and government performance, as well as political distrust, are stronger. Are these variables enough to explain the Peruvian exceptionality? Let me go quickly over the topic. According with data from Latino Barometro, Peru showed the highest level of dissatisfaction with democracy among the Andean countries, and the same applies for political parties' distrust. However, Peru ranked in a similar position than Ecuador in 2000 and 2005, but having both legal provisions to activate recall, it was only intensively used in Peru. Interestingly, despite a remarkable decrease of Ecuadorian dissatisfaction with democracy, falling from 86% in 2005 to the 50% in 2010, it was in this year, in 2010, when more than 700 requests for activating recall referenda were placed in Ecuador. Regarding municipalities' performance, data suggests a quite negative perception in all the cases. More than half part of the population believes that municipalities are not interested in their opinion, that public servants are not well prepared, and that the provision of information is scant. Other issues, such as the preferred method to protest or the best mechanism to change things, also locate Peru in a similar position than its counterparts. Based on the previous, the comparison is defined for a group having similar conditions but different outputs. Two sets of exploratory hypotheses are suggested to explain the Peruvian exceptionality. The first refers to the institutional design of the device, and the second to the intervention of electoral bodies. So, related to the institutional designs, I will consider two aspects. First, the rules to initiate a recall referendum, and we expect that the easiness to activate a referendum would have an influence increasing or decreasing the number of activations. And second, the rules to remove representatives. The probability of succeed removing the authority is also expected to play a role encouraging or discouraging activations. But also, the call of new elections could create unexpected incentives associated to the behavior of politicians who would use the referendum as an extension of the normal electoral competition. The second hypothesis refers to the institutional intervention, and especially to the guarantees offered by electoral bodies to initiate and achieve revocation, a lack of which may block or discourage activations and would express problems of democratic institutionalization. So let me go to the analysis. Table 4 presents the requirements to activate a recall referendum. The first column shows that the period in which a recall can be activated shows this. Without remarkable differences, there are two groups, one in which recall only can be activated after the half part of the mandate, Bolivia and Venezuela, another in which activation is allowed after the first year, Peru, Ecuador, or Colombia. In all the cases, it's not possible to activate recall during the last year. The second point refers to the reasons. Here we have two models, one in which there is an assessment or evaluation of the reasons, this happens in Ecuador, another in which dissatisfaction not qualified by public bodies is enough to activate a referenda. This happens in Peru and Venezuela, while Bolivia and Colombia give both options. About signatures, can be observed that the highest number is required in Colombia, while the lower in Venezuela. Regarding time, the unlimited period to collect signatures in Peru has to be noticed, as well as the 3 days established in Venezuela. Altogether, despite differences, if Colombia appears as the country where more criteria has to be fulfilled, it's unclear to what extent the easiness to activate a referenda could explain the intensity of the Peruvian use. So, second point. Regarding probabilities of succeed, Table 5 shows that the threshold to validate election is the same in Bolivia and Peru with 50%, Venezuela has the lowest with 25%, while in Ecuador does not fix a threshold. All the cases ask for a simple majority, which in Bolivia and Venezuela also has to overcome the votes the authority received when was elected. If the authority is dismissed, new elections are called in Bolivia and Colombia. However, in Colombia, only the executive could be removed through a referendum. In Venezuela, depends of the time in which it happens. In Ecuador, substitutes replace the removed authority. In Peru, if more than a third of the government, executive or regidores, is removed, a new election is called, but only to replace the removed authorities. The consequences of such design are observed in Lima right now. I'll come back to the point later, but again, I have to say that the explanation of the Peruvian exceptionality is not clearly related to these futures. Regarding institutional intervention, the Ecuadorian experience shows that when electoral bodies evaluate reasons for activations, discourage practices. In Ecuador, this referendum was introduced in 1998. At those times, required 30% of signatures and a sentence of corruption, opening questions such as why allow representatives proved to be corrupted to keep power, or the nonsense of resolving through referendum something already resolved by the judiciary. Not a single vote took place. In 2008, the new constitution extended the recall referendum to all elected authorities, reduced the number of signatures, and defined it as a political right, considering that dissatisfaction was enough to activate a collection of signatures. The number of attempts exploded in a short period of time, followed by the reaction of the Municipalities Association, which put pressure and succeeded in changing the law, dealing to the dramatical reduction of attempts. 2 registered in 2012, none succeeded in ending in a referendum. This assessment challenged the whole idea of a direct participation and gives an strange power to the electoral bodies. But the intervention of electoral bodies could also be informal. Signature collection is in charge of promoters in all the countries with the exception of Venezuela, where the collection is organized by the electoral body, given 3 days and with the presence of both promoters and authorities. There were only 10 recall elections at the local level, all in 2007, and since then, no more processes have been opened. Again, as in the case of Ecuador, it seems to discourage attempts in a country with an increasing level of political control over institutions, in other words, with lack of independence. Now, let's see how the referendum works. Okay. Research on the Ecuadorian, Bolivian, and Colombian cases show that attempts are more often registered in small communities in which it's easier to collect signatures and campaigning, something which could erode social cohesion, polarizing communities. Table 6 shows that more than 90% of recall referenda held in Peru between 1997 and 2012 took place in communities with less than 5,000 electors. Furthermore, the call of new elections has become an incentive in cases in which politicians' behavior privilege personal interest over general welfare or institutional stability, something encouraged for unstable patterns of political parties competition. In Peru, Fernando Tuesta, Isabel Remy, or Martín Tanaka, among other scholars, observed to what extent the political party system at the local level is highly fragmented, with organizations created for each elections around a person more than around any idea or program, and with few political links outside the community. It's in these cases where can be observed the alliance of the losers against the winner. On the one hand, there are deep structural problems: poverty, insufficient water supply, lack of energy. On the other, with a considerable increase of municipal resources, municipalities became a terrain disputed by personal interest. This is the scenario in which a game among politicians find in citizen dissatisfaction a fertile land. So, according with the research presented here, so in Peru, the key point is not electoral support reached by the authority when was elected, but the weaknesses of the political parties and the lack of responsibility of politicians. From the total of mayors recalled in Peru during 1997-2012, the majority is not located among the ones winning with smaller support, as shown by Table 7. So according with the research presented here, two variables seem to explain why Peru is a world champion of the Andean using recall referenda. This is because a combination of two contradictory movements. Politicians whose behavior is oriented to manipulate legal norms in their favor with electoral bodies whose work is institutionalized according with the rule of law. So I would like to go over the Lima's case in a few minutes. Okay, so I think the Lima's case could help to understand a bit more the case. Susana Villarán arrived to power unexpectedly with the new created Fuerza Social. Few months before the election, she received less than 10% of support in a campaign polarized between two candidates. When one of them was disqualified by the electoral body, he could not prove to have lived in Lima during the previous 2 years, Villarán emerged as an alternative. Mass media and economical power were openly against her candidacy. She was accused of being a communist, snob, and even to have links with terrorism. She won to Lourdes Flores from Partido Popular Cristiano for a narrow margin, less than 1%. The electoral system guaranteed to her party a majority in the council, but Fuerza Social failed in all the 42 districts of Lima Metropolitana. Once in power, she opened an audit to the previous government, which was in charge of Castañeda Locio, supported the gays and lesbian movement in a country in which Catholic Church has a considerable power, and confronted the national government. At the same time, she decided to change the city, rationalize the public transport in hands of mafias and the street markets. She also decided to focus on management more than in publicity, overestimating the importance of communicate with the people in such a context. With few alliances and too many enemies, the recall referendum was quickly in the political agenda. Interestingly, until this moment, Lima had been indifferent to what was happening around the country since 1997. As described previously, 25% of signatures are requested to activate this referendum, but up to a maximum of 4,000. It means that in Lima, with the 7% of the electoral roll was enough to activate the referendum. In small communities, the unlimited time to collect signatures doesn't play an important role, but in Lima, it worked, helping the promoters to take advantage of any incident happened during the period, including incidents with the police, or even natural disasters. The validation of signatures opened a long and highly controversial process among promoters and the three institutions in charge of an electoral process in Peru. The intention of calling new elections was evident when not only the mayor but also the whole council were proposed for a recall. Given that in Peru recall is an individual process, one vote for each member was requested. But why, despite the strong opposition and the support the recall had among the population, she was confirmed? Close to the referendum, the Brazilian-Argentinian publicist Luis Fabre, previously in charge of Humala's campaign, was hired to develop the campaign. He designed a strategy oriented to focus on the outcomes of the local governments, going over one of the weaknesses of Villarán. The lema was, Lima no puede parar. The promoters made their contribution, constantly involved in controversial debates and denounced by buying or falsificating signatures. The former mayor, Castañeda Locio, denounced by Villarán in her audit, was accused of being behind the attempt, and few weeks before the election, some proofs were presented to the public. Probably the support of Lourdes Flores, the loser on the election, but also a leader of an institutionalized party, and openly against the device since its constitutional introduction, and the silence of Humala also helped. Finally, how can be assessed the effect of the mechanism in Peru? In Lima, despite Villarán was confirmed, most of her regidores were removed from office. In a normal election, a mayor receives an automatic majority, while exceptional elections, such as the ones after a recall referenda, a successful recall referenda, are distributed in a proportional way. It means that Villarán lost majority and probably will face problems to agree on policies. In the rest of the country, it has created a quite dangerous game. There are some districts in which a recall was activated in each of the 5 periods since its introduction, and much more in which has been activated at least in 4 of the 5 periods. As shown in Table 8, in a period of 4 years, when a recall succeeds in removing the authority, there are 3 governments, adding all the time the campaign takes. Not surprisingly, the result is a clear erosion of governability. A very last point refers to the efficiency of the mechanism. This last table groups the most common reasons argued to activate a recall. While some of the reasons seems to be difficult to evaluate after the first year of government, accomplishment of the campaign program, others should be resolved for justice, corruption, or for administrative sanctions, failure in calling participatory budgeting, or in executing what was decided through it. Even more, mechanisms to force authorities to do what the law established would work much more efficiently than a recall referenda. So, paradoxically, if quite often mechanisms of participation are accused of having a limited influence on public matters, the recall referenda could be accused of having a big impact, but without resolving any of the problems for which it was proposed. Even more, probably it reinforces the instability and low institutionalization of patterns of political competition.
Thank you very much. As chair, I'm a bit afraid of a recall referendum to send me away because you want your lunch, but I'm able to turn to a federal intervention, and the president has told me that I'm allowed to go on a little bit longer in order to allow the 3 discussants, and you will get your lunch anyway. So on that basis, Leiv, would you like to lead off?
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank the presenters. It's a pity that Avritzer could not come, of course, to present. And I also want to thank Leonardo for organizing this conference. I was asked to comment on a panel of local democracy in Latin America, and I found out I know very little about local democracy in Latin America, even though I think I've read much of the literature on democratization and transition in the region. Therefore, I think that the topic is very important and very fitting for this conference. Now we have 3 papers. I won't repeat what has been said, and I'll focus more on Behrend's paper because I haven't read Welp's paper, and some general comments towards the end. Now, I think all of the papers are quite interesting, and they give us some interesting lessons that I'll get to towards the end. Behrend focused on the states levels, of course, and political change in the democratic period in Argentina, and in particular, as he stated, on federal intervention and how that might create transitions or political change. She invokes the concept of alternation, citing Pravorsky that democracy is a system where rulers lose elections. So I want to challenge you a little bit on the concept of alternation here, because it is not it's not alternation that it was at least as it was thought of in democratization literature, because here we are talking more maybe of a poder moderador that comes in and removes the elected ruler, solves the conflict, and tries to generate fairer electoral rules to create competitiveness. It's an empire more than anything else. For national level, we can think of international empires, the OAS or international courts or whatever. So I don't know if alternation is the correct concept, or at least you have to explain it a little bit more. Because what you find, of course, is that after the intervention, there is no alternation again. The general rule is that it comes in a new family, which creates a new status quo that isn't changed by elections. So is it alternation in the sense of democratization, or is it something else, or should you invoke another concept or use other comparative theories to discuss this phenomena? Because of course this study is a paradox in a sense, and you mentioned this in the paper. To intervene in a democratic system from above is, in a sense, an undemocratic action. So you're discussing how undemocratic actions can generate more democracy at the subnational level. And maybe that paradox also should be spelled out more clearly. Now, I think in general, these papers, and here I include also the Perisotto paper, which I think was quite interesting, they have some things that bind them together, and that is, in a sense, they all discuss accountability, but without invoking the concept of accountability. Your paper, Behrend paper, discusses how to create rules that manage us to make effective vertical accountability at the subnational level. The Perisotto papers invokes how to influence the policy decision making through citizen participation, and of course the Welp papers look at the dimension of how to remove rulers and hold them accountable in a sense after the fact when they do something bad or whatever. So I think one concept that could be used in the study of quality of local democracy, or could be applied more systematically in all of these papers, is actually the concept of accountability that is missing in all of these papers, but they do discuss this phenomenon. So I think that's something that binds them together, but the concept isn't used. Secondly, I think one interesting aspect, which I think is more in your paper than the other paper, is the interrelationship between the national and the local level. And it was also mentioned by Welp in the sense of having a top-down process to participation versus a bottom-up process of increasing participation. And coming from Norway, I've read about local democracy in Norway and how the welfare state has progressed very often through local initiatives that have been caught up by the state. So this conference is also about giving policy advice and looking at the policy element. And it would be an interesting angle to look at whether there is some policy diffusion from the local towards the national level that could be interesting to study when we look at the quality of democracy at the local or subnational level in Latin America. I also think there's a lesson from these papers, and also which we saw in the presentation by Mitchell Seligson, that is a lesson for anyone working at the national level, because it might be difficult to generalize at the national level if it is true that the international variation is so big that is presented by Seligson and also in your paper. So what are we really comparing here? I think that's a lesson we can draw out from these papers, that in some cases the international variation of the variables that we try to measure is greater within the nation than it is between the nations. And we might want to start thinking a little bit about what that does to our interstate comparisons as well. And I had a final comment that was on the Avritzer and Perisotto paper, which also harks a little bit back to the previous panel's discussion. They code 3 cases of successful participation, which are Chile, Uruguay, and Brazil, but they don't really discuss, as it was discussed in the previous panel, what is success, or in the previous panel, what is quality of democracy? How can you measure it? Because the answer to this clearly categorize the successful versus, or creates different categorization between the successful and not successful cases. People might be satisfied with democracy at the local or national level in Venezuela, but academics who define it in some other way puts them as the non-successful cases. So we need really to get that divide that is generated between the theoretical definitions of whatever success is of the participation and whatever the population in general thinks it is. And I think the Perisotto and Avritzer paper was really much linked to the whole debate on the rise of the left or the lefts or whatever, they need to address that discussion, and I think that is also relevant for the quality of democracy or qualities of democracy, because in the end, should we decide theoretically what this is, or should we just listen to whatever comes out of Marta Lagos or Seligsen's surveys? So I think those are the brief comments, and I give the word to.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Leiv, for helpful comments. And now it's Massimo Tommasoli.
Thank you very much, and I also join my predecessor in thanking the panelists for very interesting presentations, including the one by Avritzer, who was unable to be here. So first of all, let me just say what I think is relevant to policy debates that revolve around the concept of local government. Secondly, I will highlight some aspects that are key for me from the three papers. And then I will say 3 comments. And I hope to do it in how many minutes? 2 minutes? Okay. This is an important area because policymakers consider these as less sensitive. Local government is considered normally to be less sensitive than national, addressing issues of democracy at the national level. And at the same time, policy recommendations and policy analysis normally addresses these issues in a very ambiguous manner. There is a lot of thinking about the positive aspects of the growth of new leaders from the subnational to the national level, for example. But that, and that is true, but that is not a rule of thumb, as one of the presentations has shown. And the other thing is that there is normally some very generic language about lack of political will as the obstacle to actual effectiveness in this area. So I will not go much further into that, but I will signal to you that, for example, the UCLG work could be interesting to use it as a sort of comparative set of recommendations against which these presentations and further work on this area could be useful. Now, what struck me the most from the various presentations, and I will be very quick on these, sorry for that. First presentation by Avritzer and Peruzzotti, I think the call for what I understood as a political infrastructure for making participatory institutions and representative institutions interface work. So there is a need to address on both sides how they are relate to each other in order to make them work. Then the second presentation by Jackie, I think the value of a thick description of cases, it's focused on a federal case, so I will expand a little bit in my comments on that. Then I liked also the use of the concept of institutional arenas, because it brings into this discussion a dimension which is sort of a dimension of conflict and interaction among different political actors. And I would say in general, the unbundling of democratization through local government's lens, let's say. Looking at how decentralization can get much more complicated, democratization can get much more complicated than the intellectual picture one could have if you look at that through those lenses, as shown also in the first panel in a way. And from this last presentation, I would say this very interesting element of explaining the exceptionalism of Peru on the basis of 2 elements that are probably present also in other countries. So there may be an element there that is on one hand a sort of a risk in countries where these exceptionalism has not manifested, and perhaps the need to identify what other elements may explain the Peruvian case. But in any case, it's interesting this impact of being in a constant recall referendum mood, and what is supposed to be an instrument to actually make local government more effective turns into something that makes it ineffective. But I think, related to the first panel, you made a very important point, that the exceptionalism of Peru is related to a definition of the legal framework, that legal provision, than in other situations. Now, just 3 comments. I think that if you look at the literature on decentralization, what strikes me is that there is a reference also in that literature to different waves of decentralization, or sometimes they're called cycles. You have a decentralization cycle in the 80s, which is linked to structural adjustment, neoliberal reforms, and you have a second cycle which is starts in the late 90s, and it's more related to the call for social and democratic reform. And I think the 3 cases, actually the first paper, Avritzer's paper, takes these aspects more into account, but the 3 cases are all related to the 2 cycles in different ways. So it would be interesting to perhaps take that dimension a little bit more out in the presentations. How did these different cycles of decentralization worked in the different contexts analyzed? The second element is that we have a case from a federalist state and a case from a unitary state system. So I think perhaps another element could be to look into these differences. How do, you're talking about, Jackie, federalism, interventionism, let's say, in the case of local government, but do we have a comparative basis of a similar type of interventionism in state unitary systems? And that could be a good basis for comparison. Thirdly, I think there are methodological implications. First of all, IDEA has an assessment methodology which looks at the national level, but also one that looks at the local level, the state of local democracy assessment. And what I take from this conversation is that probably there is a need, in our case, to take more into account, or match perhaps, citizen perceptions of the state of democracy at the local level and expert assessments that look at the, that thickness. Maybe we could call them some ethnographies of local decentralization, political decentralization. That could probably provide a more balanced result in terms of assessing, capturing both citizens' perceptions and also expert assessments, looking precisely at the things that you both have addressed. The second methodological implication has already been addressed. There is a need for drilling down to the subnational level. Perhaps we should get back to that issue, and we could have an opportunity to do that before the end of these 2 days. But I do think that there is a need for looking also in national analysis at the diversity at the subnational level, because it tells a lot about different paces, as Martha said, perhaps also on the basis of different regions or states, etc. The last comment is about methodological comment, is that what was lacking from the presentation is an unbundling of the concept of subnational. We have at least 2 levels. One is the level of the state or the intermediate governments, and the other one is the level of municipalities. So how do the 2 levels interplay, and how the 2 levels together interplay with the national level? I think that is probably something that might require some more thoughts and perhaps also some comparative analysis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jesus.
Thanks, Laurence. Well, as my colleagues, I want to thank Leonardo for his invitation, but I have to speak in Spanish because I am not very clear about what I am saying, so I have to be clear more in Spanish in this speculation. Bien, creo que una idea importante es, luego de la utilidad comparativa en los casos, es profundizar en cada caso cuando hay determinadas desviaciones o paradojas por las razones de cada caso. Es decir, qué es lo que se aparta de lo comparativo. Y justamente estas dos ponencias, especialmente la de Yanina en el caso peruano, podrían profundizar en ese sentido. Digo esto por la siguiente razón. Si es que en el marco de la propuesta teórica y metodológica de la calidad de la democracia, un elemento positivo que incrementa la misma, que mejora la calidad de la democracia, es los instrumentos de democracia directa, como referéndums, como plebiscitos, que incrementan la participación política. En el caso peruano podemos ver que justamente este elemento empeora, debilita la calidad de la democracia. Es decir, tenemos un instrumento como este referéndum que si comparamos Perú con todo el mundo, hay más referéndums en Perú que en el resto de países del mundo, ¿no? Y se ha convertido en un instrumento para generar un incentivo para desestabilizar o generar ingobernabilidad, ¿no? Si tuviéramos que titular un trabajo como el que se desarrolla sobre referéndum en Perú, podríamos decir: si no te puedo ganar, te tumbo. If I can win you now, I will kick you later. En ese sentido, el punto es que junto con el referéndum podríamos decir que el nivel de competitividad, de participación, es bastante alto, digamos. Pero alto con el efecto perverso de que genera inestabilidad en los gobiernos, tanto municipales como regionales, dado que el periodo se acorta considerablemente y los actores locales tienen un incentivo poderoso para usar ese instrumento con el efecto contrario del que se pretendió instituir, ¿no? Ahora, el punto es, Yanina, ¿cuáles son el contexto dentro del caso peruano que permite revertir el efecto? Es decir, que transforma una situación normativamente positiva para la democracia en un resultado negativo para la misma. Y lo ha mencionado Yanina y quisiera volver a destacar. Uno es la absoluta fragmentación del sistema de partidos que ocurre desde aproximadamente 20 años, ¿no? Un poco antes del triunfo de Alberto Fujimori. Para dar una idea de esta fragmentación, si en Perú tenemos 23 regiones, ¿no?, equivalente a provincias o estados, hay un partido diferente por cada región en el gobierno, ¿no? Y esto se multiplica por cada pequeña municipalidad. Entonces podríamos hablar de 60, 70, 80 partidos en Perú. Curiosamente, si vamos al caso brasileño, esta alta fragmentación a través de un ejercicio de habilidad política pudo ser conducido para una mejora de la calidad de democracia a través de los gobiernos de coalición que tanto Cardoso como Lula, sobre todo este último, lograron implementar en los últimos años. En Brasil también la fragmentación es altamente extrema. El punto entonces es que el otro condicionante, juntamente con la alta fragmentación en el Perú, es esta baja satisfacción con la democracia, que hace que los actores simplemente no tengan un referente institucional ni de valores para actuar en un marco competitivo, y simplemente prevalecen los intereses inmediatos, no tanto de partidos, sino de pequeños grupos de familias en el ámbito micro, local, y en el ámbito regional. Yo creo que este es un caso que nos permite proyectar a otra reflexión sobre la calidad de la democracia. Si bien es importante o es el eje central en términos de nuestros intereses respecto de una visión comparativa, una siguiente vuelta de tuerca, un siguiente momento, es regresar al estudio de caso que permite entender este tipo de desviaciones con los contextos, con las variables independientes que hacen que una medida aparentemente buena para la calidad de democracia se convierta en una medida opuesta en su resultado. Y esto implica, y esto es uno de los comentarios no solamente para esta mesa, sino para la anterior, respecto de la necesidad de proyectar variables históricas para explicar estas diversas calidades de democracia. Variables históricas en dos sentidos, tanto de un tiempo histórico inmediato, podría uno proyectarse hacia atrás unos 20 o 30 años, casi desde que podríamos decir empieza la democratización de estos países, y qué tipos de democratización tienen, y por ello cuáles son los factores que podrían explicar, porque eso es creo que una cosa que remarca Leonardo, el tipo de calidad democrática que tiene un país, es decir, cuáles son las variables independientes a proponer y aprobar para explicar esta variedad de calidades democráticas. Y segundo, también una proyección temporal, no solo de este, no sé si llamar corto o mediano plazo, son en el fondo 30 años, sino de un poco más largo plazo, y hablo de las democratizaciones de los países latinoamericanos en el siglo XX, en estas tres olas que se puede distinguir a inicios del siglo XX, luego de la Segunda Guerra Mundial y finalmente, como ya mencioné, a partir de los años 80. Entonces yo creo que el regresar al estudio de caso, que es lo que se ha intentado con el grupo que trabajamos con Leonardo, en estos estudios de caso, para distinguir algo que lo comparativo no necesariamente puede ver, ¿no? Es la especificidad los que nos introduce a algunos elementos propios para explicar lo que la visión global, cuando el bosque uno puede mirar mejor, ¿no? Pero también mirando el árbol uno puede encontrar razones particulares. Pero mirando el árbol y en una situación retrospectiva donde introducimos la historia, podríamos decir, como sucede en muchos de los papers, acá la historia también importa para explicar esta trayectoria de calidades democráticas. Para comentar el trabajo de Jacqueline, quisiera hacer una breve comparación con lo que viene sucediendo en México, ¿no? Y también hay un factor, si escogemos una variable independiente como la que señala Jacqueline de una intervención federal, en el caso mexicano, respecto de estos tres casos, pero en el caso mexicano para todos los estados, hay el caso opuesto, es decir, hay un retiro, hay una pérdida de influencia del ámbito federal en los estados, ¿no? Aproximadamente desde el inicio de la alternancia, el fin de la transición, el inicio de la alternancia en el año 2000. ¿Y qué ocurre con este retiro de la influencia federal, ¿no? Y podríamos hipotetizar que eso podría haber implicado una mayor pluralidad de expresiones partidarias y de intereses locales, pero esto ocurrió exactamente lo contrario y un resultado igual que al argentino, es decir, una predominancia de prácticas iliberales, de prácticas autoritarias, en la medida que la pérdida de un eje centralizador y de control a nivel federal implicó un extraordinario crecimiento de un poder local, ¿no? Y por tanto el punto, como señalan algunos periodistas mexicanos, ya no es un fortalecimiento del federalismo mexicano, sino un incremento del feudalismo, ¿no? Señor feudal, del feudalismo mexicano. Quiere decir que cada gobernador se convierte en un pequeño rey de su propio estado, y esto no solo de un tipo de partido, sino de los tres partidos más importantes en México. Quiere decir entonces que la concentración de poder va a implicar una marginalización de la oposición, una represión de la participación política, un control de los órganos paralelos como el Poder Judicial y el Poder Electoral, así como las instituciones electorales. Entonces vamos a ver que una situación opuesta a la que menciona Jacqueline, un retiro del control federal, va a producir el mismo efecto. Quiere decir entonces, otra vez regresando a la intervención inicial, que hay que ver los casos particulares de tal manera de explicar cómo una intervención federal, en el caso Argentina, de estas 3 provincias, y un retiro de la intervención federal, una autonomización de los gobiernos estatales, va a tener el mismo efecto de prácticas iliberales, de síntomas autoritarios. Y en esa idea, para mencionar una reciente hecho relevante en la reforma política aprobada hace una semana en México, ahora viene una nueva intervención federal, ¿no?, para tratar de controlar todos estos fenómenos de incremento exacerbado, de debilitamiento democrático en los estados. Claro que esa intervención federal no tiene ese propósito de democratizar, tiene un propósito sobre todo de que el partido de gobierno controle nuevamente los estados y sobre todo evite el extremo endeudamiento de los estados, ¿no?, que ha originado un profundo endeudamiento a nivel de la deuda nacional, y en ese sentido también recuperar algo que ha sido un efecto perverso muy notable, la pérdida del rule of law, del orden mexicano. Parte de la explicación de la guerra civil actual en México es que cuando había un control federal sobre todos los estados, había ciertos acuerdos con determinados carteles del narcotráfico que permitían una división del territorio por áreas controladas, y entonces había un acuerdo no solamente entre el gobierno y los carteles, sino entre los propios carteles. Cuando este equilibrio vicioso del orden se rompe, cuando ya desaparece un controlador nacional, cada estado pretende hacer su propio acuerdo, ¿no? Y cada estado no coordina con otro estado, finalmente esto termina en un enfrentamiento entre carteles disputándose los estados. La guerra no solo es entre el estado y los carteles, es entre los propios carteles en una disputa territorial salvaje. Regreso finalmente entonces no solamente a comentar a ambas ponencias, que no tuve la oportunidad de leerlas, sino de escucharlas que se presentó en este momento, a comentar finalmente respecto de la mesa anterior. Creo que el punto de efectivamente la calidad de democracia implica un nuevo nivel de discusión sobre el concepto de democracia, ¿no? Y este nuevo nivel de discusión cambia algunos ejes ya consensuados en términos de lo que era la democracia mínima, básicamente estos requisitos schumpeterianos que luego Dahl operacionaliza mejor, y nos proyecta a nuevas dimensiones donde ya no son solo los procedimientos, sino también la satisfacción del ciudadano y la relación entre ciudadanos y estados, los que nos permiten evaluar cuál es el desempeño de esta democracia. Sin embargo, en esta nueva giro viene esa ruptura del consenso anterior, y me parece que esa ruptura siempre es buena. Digamos, el conocimiento no avanza de manera regular y continua, como recuerdan ustedes esta cosa de la construcción y de la deconstrucción de la ciencia, sino a veces hay momentos en que se interrumpe este proceso muy radicalmente y se vuelven a construir unas nuevas bases de la ciencia. En este sentido, entonces, yo creo que es relevante no solamente la propuesta de Leonardo, sino algo que en términos empíricos, en términos prácticos implica, y lo cual esta reunión es relevante para ello, una comunidad científica especializada en el balance de la evaluación democrática, si es que no solamente pensamos en términos de calidad democrática, ya que otras instituciones hablan sobre democraticidad o sobre desarrollo democrático, pero bueno, estamos en ese punto, y de tal forma de que estas reuniones nos permitan esta reconstrucción del consenso, si no es un consenso per se, si es un consenso académico, si no es un consenso por votaciones, si es un consenso en términos de argumentación y demostración con pruebas empíricas, y el punto está, Leonardo, cuando nos volvemos a reunir para continuar este debate que recién está empezando en base a este primer resultado que se ofrece a través de esta publicación que hace IDEA, digamos. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Jesus. Well, I'm looking at I'm under federal intervention. Do you want any more, or do we need to stop right now? So we'll take a couple. Good. Okay. Yes. Well, I think that answers my question. No, I'm going to allow the President to ask his question.
What are the key open questions when we analyze the qualities of democracy at sub-national level? First, unit of analysis. There is a sort of agreement among you that the unit of analysis is the state. You think about Mexico, Jackie, you think about Argentina, if we think Leonardo, we think about Brazil, but actually there could be other units of analysis that also can on. So first of all, we have to be clear and conscious about what is the units of analysis. Second point, and I think Jackie papers, in a sense, made open and explicit this point. When we assess a democracy, we try to measure a democracy, we usually, for example, also in my work, we consider, say, the last picture, that is the last data, and we analyze the last data. On the contrary, your interest was in terms of process, that is of development. In that case, Jackie, your problem was the notion of democratization. Because with democratization, you have a sort of umbrella notion. So, for example, from my point of view, what I was saying, you need another notion, and the notion I was suggesting was deepening, worsening of the quality of democracy at sub-national level. But again, you are analyzing a process. So there are two ways of analyzing the quality of democracies, of course, also at sub-national level, last shot, and the process. It depends basically on the data. You write at the three cases, so you could go in that direction. Then, now, what are the relevant variables, the relevant aspect of the process of the relevant mechanism? Of course, from my point of view, there is a relatively simpler reply. That is, let's look at the 8 dimensions, and let's see what sub-dimensions of those 8 dimensions are start with some agenda. Okay?
Adam?
I have a couple of comments on the recall paper. I fail to see why recalls would be in any way more participatory than elections. Just people vote for us, but they do exactly the same. They organize, they vote. So why is that participatory? Why is it direct democracy? Why does it feel fundamental ideas of the organ? What I would see is recalls of not elected officials, recalls of public functionaries appointed from above, like heads of schools, heads of local police, heads of local post office. Think of the design of democratic institutions. There's a gaping hole, which is that citizens do not have instruments to directly control the bureaucracy that's supposed to serve them. Yet that direction is completely indirect. At best, it's exercised through elected officials who then control the top rungs of bureaucracy, which they don't, which then controls the lower ranks of democracy. We just don't have that mechanism. We don't have that mechanism because when the U.S. Constitution was written, the government employed 4,500 people. Borrowed somewhere employed today. But that would be participatory. And more than that, I believe that most people feel dissatisfaction with or feel ineffective in the democracy precisely because this is what they cannot control.
Thank you. Jean-Michel?
Yes, just 10 seconds. I think we have to mention something which is in relation with what I said, peace tables and the other thing, which is the petrol case. So it's a kind of traditional call. It's in the actual reality. It shows us that the question of federal power or the central power in relation with the local power can be complex in terms of analysis of democracy, because it is in reality the result of the conception of rule of law, which leads give power to procurador, and when it was designed in the sense of rule of law. Now, many people see that as a limit of democracy, because of course there is the risk of arbitrariness and so on. So I think it's something which makes think.
Or administering or running a Latin American city, you're not quite sure whether it's the procurador who's going to bring you down, or it's the federal government, or it's the recall election. There are many different possible lines of constraint. Yes, Philippe.
Just a very, very quick point. I didn't hear what I thought was the main hypothesis that we had historically about the relation between national and subnational democracy, and that was the so-called nationalization of party systems. Okay? The idea that this is going to come by government intervention is, I don't know, okay, that's Argentina maybe, but I mean, that's not an integral part of our understanding of how historically democracies have developed. What was supposed to do was the contagion effect, the neighborhood, what do you want to call it, and the mechanism for that is supposed to be the nationalization of party systems, which would then penetrate, dissolve, if you wish, these local oligarchies of various kinds as a side function of the competition, a nationalization of lots of things. That was supposed to do it, and more or less in Europe, that's what happened. Okay, why not? I mean, then I hear you over here doesn't even sound like it's got a party system. I mean, so obviously the answer is parties are not doing what they're supposed to be doing, at least in this particular channel of.
I mean, the Avritzer and Peruzotti paper says 5 out of 8 don't have a party system any longer. It's disintegrated, and that even in the others, it's not adequate, and these other channels are emerging because the party system is not doing it. Yes. And that's relevant to the quality of democracy in general. I mean, I wanted to ask this morning, but maybe this is not the right time to do it. You know, can you have a democracy without parties? This is a relevant question for. Sorry, Manolo. I'm sorry, Marta, Manolo. Right, okay. Ladies first. Marta. Marta? You would?
Yes, I follow Leonardo and his comment about subnational level. It seems to me you have to cut somewhere. And I think we are comparing political communities here. And of course, in a distance sense, and of course, if we compare political communities, then the subnational level is not relevant for the comparative purpose. Now, it might be relevant for the country purpose, but then we could introduce the degree of deviance or spread of the solidity of the political community within the country in order to reflect that diversity within the country. But you have to cut clear at some point with respect to, what is it that we are analyzing? And if we're not analyzing political community, then what is it? National political community. And with respect to the party system, I'm sorry to increase the confusion on that. We do surveys every year on 18 countries. And in more than 7 countries, we're not able to get from the experts the correct list of what people identify as parties. So if you can get a list of 80 parties being identified by people in the responses, and from the experts you only get 60 of those names. So this is how atomized the whole thing is.
Leonardo? Manolo, all right.
Son dos puntos muy breves, metodológicos, a la cuestión subnacional. Yo creo que debemos corregir ese término.
Como catalán.
Podría hablar del tema español, pero voy a hablar del tema boliviano.
Sí.
El tema boliviano, lo subnacional, no existe y puede ser considerado políticamente un insulto.
Sí.
Decir algo subnacional. Creo que estamos utilizando un término probablemente, yo creo que lo correcto es subestatal. Estamos hablando de unidades del Estado y las provincias o los estados o los departamentos son unidades del Estado, no son subnaciones. Eso es algo que creo que es importante. Y luego lo segundo, creo que aquí hay una carga de profundidad, Leonardo, muy fuerte a los estudios clásicos de política comparada, algo que hemos discutido. Yo creo que la intervención en este sentido, muy claramente de Jesús es obvia, ¿no? O sea, hay que reforzar los estudios de caso. Y los estudios de caso con una profundidad en este sentido además histórica, ¿no? Histórico de corto y de largo plazo.
Sorry, Danielle. Yes.
It's extremely important to see how, even though it is now 35 years that Latin America kicked off the process of urbanization, and to a certain extent we try to force and to try to understand Latin America based on assumptions that was written probably 40 years ago in a completely different context. It's like to see why the Latinos we are different than the Swedish guys. I mean, we are not that tall, that blonde, that blue eyes. It's not going to happen. You know? It's not going to happen.
You have to be blonde and blue eyes to have political parties.
Wait, but the type of the assumption that you said that because in Europe, with the welfare state, you have a party system, that the assumption was that then at the subnational level that will be done. It's not happening. You may like it or not, you may say this wrong, but it's not happening. When you go to a country like Bolivia, and you talk to the guys who are running that country, who are the original people from there, and you talk
political party system through federal intervention is not going to happen. But this is what precisely are doing in Mexico now. IFE, that gave a lot of autonomy to the federal state, now is converted in INE, and the three main political parties in Mexico now want to control every single thing happening in 32 states. So we have all this tension that we need to take into account if we want to have a good understanding, not what we would like to see what's happening in Latin America, but what is really happening. And I think that that could be a good event that we can have.
Although the Mexican political reform does also have citizen candidates and financing for citizen candidates, so it's more complicated as usual. I'm afraid that if I don't exert a little restraint at a certain point, there will be a recall referendum because you will all go off for lunch anyhow. So this is a discussion which I think has been rich and productive and was going to carry on for the rest of the conference, but I'm going to call it a close now. Thank you very much.